Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us. If you are new to Bridgeway, we are here at the conclusion or the finale of a group of sermon series or sermons that we've been exploring the topic of community. So we have been looking at what it means to connect to other people and how that relates to our spiritual growth for the last month. And I'm excited for today because we're going to land the plane, as it were, with a very, very simple challenge for you today, which is to join a small group. We're going to talk more about why that's important, but I think at the outset, it's important for you to know that at Bridgeway, our vision as a church is to be a church without walls. And that means a lot of different things. But one of the things that it does mean also is that it means that what happens beyond our walls in our community is as important as what happens on a Sunday morning right here at church. And as it pertains to community, this means that we value gathering in different environments around dinner tables and coffee shops all throughout the week because we understand that's a huge part of a huge need for us as disciples. Also, our mission as a church, many of you know, is a three-part statement. The first is connecting to God. Second is connecting to others. And third is connecting others to God. And it's that second part of the mission of Bridgeway that we've been focusing on this month, because in some ways, if you are not involved in a small gathering, whether that's through a connect group or a D group or a class at Bridgeway, you haven't actually experienced what it really means to be a part of our community. Many of us have engaged on a Sunday morning like we're doing today, which is fantastic, but you haven't really understood who we are until you understand what it means to gather in a connection group. So we're going to talk more about that this morning, and we're just going to, again, end with a very simple challenge, because ultimately growing as a disciple is synonymous with being connected in community. And each week I've been sharing certain anecdotes, and I want to share with you one that I learned this week. I was reading a University of Washington study, and as an Oregon Duck, I am skeptical of that study already, but we'll accept it, even though they are Huskies. They found that the average person knows 611 people. Now, this means just people you are close to, so it could be family or friends. It could be people in your neighborhood. It could be people that you work with or go to church with. So apparently, on average, 611 people you know. And let's just accept that for conversation's sake this morning. But it would not surprise you to know that out of that 611 people, those people that you know, there's actually a very small percentage of people that you are actually close to. And one study actually argued or found that there's about 6 people in your life that really know you. And actually, if anything, anecdotally, I would say that number sounds high. But when we're talking about knowing you, I mean people that you will share the last 10% with, right? What I mean by that is it's really easy to have a certain level of connection with most people, right? We could have a conversation and I could tell you some things that are happening in my life. I could tell you, if my kids are healthy or how school is going, right? We could have a certain level of connection. But let's be honest, like how many people in your life will you really go that last 10% with? That really know what your marriage is like, that really know your financial situation, or the things that you deeply care about, or the things that you're most fearful of. My kind of anecdotal evidence suggests that would be between 3 and 0 people for the average person. A lot of us, if we think about our lives as a big room, there's a lot of people in it. Which means that most of our lives are still going to be full of busyness. There's going to be lots of chatter. There's going to be people you bump into. But it's like that cliche. Sometimes there's nothing more lonely than a crowded room. This idea that we're surrounded by people and there's noise and there's, hey, how are you? But there's a dearth of deep community and connection. And this is important for us because there is a relationship between community and our growth and formation as disciples. And this is something I came up with, but let's just kind of frame in our conversation this morning by thinking about community in the following terms, is that community is the sum of intimacy and commitment. And so by intimacy, I simply mean the degree to which we are known by others and that we know others, right, and vice versa. And also commitment, which means that we understand that community involves a bond, a commitment, an understanding that come what may, I'm going to remain in community and relationship with you, even if we have challenges. That's right. So as we have more of intimacy and more commitment, we will have more community and more formation. A word on formation. In fact, there's a really great book. It's called Foundations of Spiritual Formation. It's a collection of a number of theologians and scholars who committed or who submitted papers about what it means to be formed as a disciple. Now, one of the contributors to this book, again, Foundations of Spiritual Formation, is the author and theologian Darrell Bach. He teaches actually downtown at Dallas Theological Seminary, an incredible, incredible theologian. And he wrote a chapter on formation and community. First of all, what is formation? Right? That's not usually the word we associate with Christian faith, but he refers to it as, or he calls formation, all that God undertakes and undergoes to bring us to maturity. Formation points to the resources God brings to the task of forming us into his likeness. And so Darrell Bach goes on to identify one of those resources, one of the things that God uses to transform or to form us as community. He says this about community as it pertains to spiritual formation. He says, spiritual formation is a divine work of transformation of our heart and character. Namely, that it does involve actually us as individuals, but he continues, it also aims at an engagement with others. When a person comes to new life in Christ through faith, God provides all of the elements necessary for spiritual growth. The Spirit is certainly the major component, but it is also the community, both in terms of encouraging the believer in growth and as a point of identification and representation. And so kind of all by way of introduction here, right? There's a relationship between how we are being formed as disciples, as we are being transformed into the image of Jesus, right, which is the goal of discipleship, and the degree to which we are engaged in community. And so community, though, again, as we've been talking about, it's a complicated term. There's a lot of different manifestations of community, and sometimes it can be difficult to understand how this all fits together. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look into the New Testament, particularly at the Gospels. And the Gospels are the story of Jesus' life and his ministry, his death and resurrection. And we're going to look at this because, first of all, asking what would Jesus do or what did Jesus do is a pretty good place to start, right? It's not a bad place to begin. But also we're going to see that in the story of Jesus, there are three distinct understandings or pictures of community. And each of them has some benefits. And I would argue that all three are necessary for our formation as disciples, but there are also different challenges. And maybe, at least in the first one, you'll see there are some challenges or even downsides to certain types of community. So we're going to look at those. And today we're going to be just challenging you to take a step deeper into community. And so for some of this, that means joining a group for the first time. For others, it might mean taking a look at how we are engaging practically and to see if there's ways that we can go deeper. But let's look at the first picture, which is the picture of a crowd. Mark 3, 7 through 8, we'll start there as just one example, but I say this, that most of Jesus' ministry takes place in or amongst crowds of people, and this is just one example. It says, when Jesus went out to the lake with his disciples, that's meaning the 12, a large crowd followed him. They came from all over Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and from east of the Jordan River, and even as far north as Tyre and Sidon. The news about his miracles had spread far and wide, and vast numbers of people came to see him. And so we see, first of all, the basic idea of how crowds work. Right? There's the word is out about Jesus. He's a powerful teacher. The idea is that he preaches with authority that is not common among the other scribes and teachers of the law. There's also the words out that he's a miracle worker. And that at times, some of these large gatherings, he actually provides food for people for free, which as a poor peasant farmer is very, very appealing. And so it's no wonder that all of a sudden crowds start to come and follow Jesus. And it's important to note here also that crowds have value. We should not neglect the value of crowds. When we gather together in large groups, a number of things happen. We gain a certain sense of identity by belonging to crowds. We have a certain idea of movement, or the idea that I'm a part of something bigger than myself when I'm a part of these large gatherings. We get identity, purpose, and a sense of meaning by belonging to a crowd. And that's important, and it's valid. In fact, what we do today, what we do on Sunday mornings in some ways is how kind of a crowd operates. We're here, and I realize a lot of you know one another, but as a general rule, we're a large group. Now, that's really inspiring when we come together to sing and to worship and to remember communion together and to sit under God's word together, right? There's real value here. But also, if you've ever noticed this, if this is your only expression of Christian community, there's a very good chance that you're missing a part of the bigger picture. Because as much as crowds are a good thing and they have a purpose, there are serious downsides, 3 to name a few. First of all, they are largely speaking anonymous, right? It's easy here. You could sit at Bridgeway and you can be relatively speaking anonymous, although maybe at Bridgeway it's a little harder for you to do than other churches, but you can be anonymous, relatively speaking. There's also relatively low degrees of commitment required to being a part of a crowd, right? Namely, you just have to show up. And you're a part. And that's good, but there's also low commitment. There's also, if this is your only expression of community, there's also probably low degrees of transformation that occurs in the context of crowds. And just one example from Jesus' ministry about the downsides of a crowd. It's found in John chapter 6. And so we see Jesus is preaching, people are coming to him, they're flocking to him. At this point, he can do no wrong. And then Jesus preaches a sermon that people do not like. Now, I've never personally had this experience, but I've read in books that sometimes pastors can preach unpopular sermons. Now, let me just read you a few excerpts from this to get a sense for maybe why the teaching did not land that particular day. I think you'll get a general sense. This is in John chapter 6, verses 53 and following. Just a few excerpts. It says, Jesus said again, I tell you the truth. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you cannot have eternal life within you. For my flesh is true food, my blood is true drink. Skipping ahead, many of his disciples said, this is very hard to understand. How can anyone accept it? Jesus was aware that his disciples were complaining, so he said to them, does this offend you? I think it did. It says at this point, many of his disciples turned away and deserted him. Now, in this particular instance, there's obviously no problem with the preacher or the sermon. The crowd misunderstands what Jesus is trying to get across. He wants them to understand that he is the bread of life, that when you come to identify with Jesus, you will be filled in a way that physical bread will never be able to fill you, so forth and so on. But he preaches this message, and he sort of leaves it out there ambiguously. And a lot of people are wondering, like, Jesus, are you telling us we need to come and literally eat parts of your flesh? Like, that's gross. That's cannibalism. We don't do that. And now Jesus he chooses not to clarify it, right? And so you see, right, in this big crowd, almost like towards the periphery, people starting like, you know what, I'm not in this stuff anymore. Like, I've come this far. It was fun when he was feeding us. Fun when he was doing miracles, but I'm out. And you see that the crowd, and again, as much as it is a good thing, Jesus has compassion for crowds. He teaches to crowds. He loves crowds. But crowds, by their nature, are fickle. They have low commitment, so it's very easy. Like, hey, if I say something you don't like, well, at some point you could just kind of walk out the door and never come back. And we experience this in churches and in different types of environments where there are large groups of people, right? There are positives, but there are also, especially as crowds are concerned, there's some major downsides if our goal is to be deeply formed as disciples, which is why we are introduced to the next picture of community in the New Testament, which I think is crucial for us. I realize everyone here, you're sitting in a crowd today. So again, good job, but there's something more. There's something deeper. And we see this next picture is the 12 disciples themselves. And they're actually eventually called simply the 12. And these are the young men that Jesus eventually, out of this big crowd, calls to himself and invites them into a deeper level of relationship. And it's just one example. Again, Matthew 4, also in Mark 1, there's a number of places in the New Testament where we see Jesus call his disciples to himself. It says, one day as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and Andrew, and they were throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And they left their nets at once and followed him. A little farther up the shore, he saw two other brothers, James and John, sitting in a boat with their father Zebedee, repairing their nets. And he called to them. He said, they immediately followed, leaving the boat and their father behind. And so we've seen these pictures, and if you've been around church for a while, you've probably heard maybe a story or a sermon on this, and it's an amazing story. But I think sometimes, as modern Americans, right, 21st century Americans, we have a different view of what it means to be called as a disciple than Jesus originally intended it. See, if you were a first century Jew, you would know exactly what was meant by the words, "Come, follow me." This was the invitation of a rabbi made to a disciple to allow them to become part of their inner circle, or his inner circle as a student. Now, I think this is important here because as Christians, I think many times we have adopted a practical view of discipleship as the following. I believe in a certain abstract set of principles, right? I believe, or not principles, but I believe the right things, like that Jesus, is the Son of God, that he died for my sins, he rose again. So I believe all of these things. And then I am given the promise of eternal life, which means at the end of my life, I get to go to heaven. And that's true. And you need to know that. And that gives us a lot of hope. But that is not the definition of discipleship. You see, again, we think about believe here, go to heaven here, and we think about everything that happens in the middle as some sort of optional things that I may or may not do while I'm here on earth. And I would suggest that that is to fundamentally misunderstand the invitation of discipleship that Jesus offers you and me. Being a disciple, we don't get to decide, by the way, what being a disciple means. Jesus decides what that means. And as a first century rabbi, we actually know a lot about what it means to be a disciple. For instance, when a rabbi would approach a young man, a young boy, to be a disciple, it was the chance of a lifetime. Sometimes we're like, well, why would James and John, why would they just leave their nets and follow Jesus? It's because everyone knew that this was a better option. Following Jesus, being a student of a rabbi, let alone this particular rabbi, this was the chance of a lifetime. And we also know that based on how first century Judaism works and how boys were taken through levels of schooling, we actually know that all of the disciples that Jesus chooses, all these boys, were actually passed over by other rabbis. So there are different levels of schooling. And they're called like houses of learning, right? And there's 3. All young boys were invited to this, basically the first level where they would learn to read and write, and you would study Torah. So it was like grammar school. Think about it that way. And so all Jewish boys and all Jewish girls were actually allowed to be a part of this school because they wanted to learn to read and write and especially to study Torah. But then what would happen at the end of kind of primary school or elementary school, the ones who were at the top of the heap were invited to go to the next level, call it middle school for lack of a better term. And then eventually, if you were at the top of that heap, you would get to go to high school. And then, if you were really lucky, a rabbi might notice you and say, "Come, follow me, be my disciple." This was like the culmination. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. And we see that when Jesus invites these men to become his disciples, they immediately leave. But here's the other part it's hard for us to understand. When they say yes to Jesus, notice it says they got up and they left their nets. They left their entire lives behind because why? Because they were now following a rabbi. And there was nothing abstract about this. They would literally follow Jesus wherever he went. So if Jesus is going to Capernaum, the disciples go to Capernaum. When Jesus was eating breakfast, guess what the disciples were doing? They were eating breakfast. But more specifically, what the disciples would do is if they noticed that Rabbi Jesus, if he ate his eggs scrambled, Guess how all of the disciples ate their eggs? Scrambled. And so what you would find is that Jewish disciples would do everything that their rabbi did. They would shop at the same stores. They would buy the same food. They would wear the same clothes. And in fact, actually, in current Judaism today, if you'll notice in like Orthodox Hasidic Judaism, you'll see some of the times the men wear these mink fur hats. Have you ever seen those? A few of you not? Okay, I should have put that up on screen. They do. And they're these fur hats. But some of them are pointy, and some of them are wide. Some of them have different shapes and different materials. And as it turns out, you can actually tell, if you know this world, you can tell which rabbi you follow by the shape and the style of your hat. This is what it means to be a disciple. To be a disciple, by definition, is to enter into a process of deep formation where you ultimately say, you know what, that's who I was. My goal now is to be exactly like my rabbi in every possible way. So not only do I eat the same food and dress the same way, I also, as a disciple, I adopt the same yoke as my rabbi. And a yoke is a first century idea, right? It's this idea of an interpretation of Scripture. There's a place in the New Testament where Jesus says, my yoke is easy. And he's referring to specifically a particular way of looking at Torah, at the law, at the Jewish law and prophets, that was easy compared to some of the other rabbis. And so all of Jesus' disciples are to also have an easy yoke, and we are to imitate Jesus' use of Scripture, right? It goes down to everything that we think, we feel, the kind of clothes we wear, the shoes we wear, right? It all becomes a reflection of Jesus as our rabbi. And so when Jesus says, come follow me, he is inviting us into a deep process of change that involves, among other things, being connected to a community. And so as Jesus invites them to be, these 12 men to be part of his inner circle, he actually calls them into close community with each other. And so on a practical level, daily, moment by moment, they are walking together, and this is where change happens. We see that change, for the most part, we have no record of what happened in the lives of the hundreds or thousands of people that surrounded Jesus. But we actually know a lot about the 12 disciples. And it's not all good. See, I think this is one of the problems with community. We all talk about it, and then the idea is, oh, now we're going to get to know one another. And if you're a Bible person, you could probably rattle off for me 3 or 4 things where Peter fails abysmally. Right, we know this, right? Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Peter takes his eyes off Jesus in the storm, like, shame on you, Peter. Well, guess what? That comes part and parcel with being in community, because we're known. We understand each other's flaws and each other's strengths. We understand how some of the places in our lives where we have a lot of room to grow. But I want to suggest that when we become part of the 12, this is where formation starts to happen. We see that we undergo a deep process of being known, of being changed, and submitting ourselves to the leadership of our rabbi, who is Jesus. And so we see this next picture evolve. And I think this is where, again, for us, in practical terms, this is where discipleship really begins. Because it means we're known. It means we are committed. It means that we have a bond that is unique to a smaller group of people. But you also may notice that in the story of Jesus, there are 3 of these 12 disciples who emerge as sort of the inner circle, the core of the core, which are Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John are brothers, and they are invited into a unique place in terms of Jesus' life and ministry. There are 3 places in Jesus' ministry where he invites only the 3 to come along with him. And it turns out they're like the big moments of Jesus' ministry. First, there's the healing or the raising of Jairus' daughter. So the first time Jesus raises someone from the dead, we also see the transfiguration. This is the time where Jesus, his full glory, is shown on the top of a mountain, and Elijah and Moses are there. Really big deal. Peter, James, and John are there with him. We also see that in the very last moments of Jesus' life, Peter, James, and John are invited to come to be with Jesus as he is praying in Gethsemane. And if we could ever say that if Jesus had like an emotional crisis or a low point in his life and ministry, it was that night. And guess who was there? 3 of his closest friends. And so we see in the life and ministry of Jesus, he models this. First of all, again, crowds are welcome. Crowds come to Jesus. And he loves the crowds, and the crowds love him. But out of that crowd, he selects 12 people to be a part of his inner circle. We might call it, in modern terms, it would be his small group. It would be a group of people that he is uniquely committed to. Not that the crowd's not important, but he simply said, hey, we're going to be on a different level. You're going to have different expectations. There's going to be different challenges. There's going to be different opportunities. But you're going to be a part of a smaller group. And even in that group, when it came down to those really poignant moments in Jesus' life, he had 3 men who he was going to share those opportunities with, or those moments with. And so what I want to suggest to you is that this is an analogy for our spiritual growth and formation as disciples, right? If Jesus had a crowd, if Jesus had a 12, and if he had 3, and if we are trying to be like Jesus, it would stand to reason that we should emulate his example. But you already knew that. Like, none of this stuff is like, wow, man, mind-blowing theological insight here. Because we all know that community is important. We all know that belonging to a group, we get some purpose from it. We also know that it's important to be a part of a smaller entity of people that know us. And you also know that when it really comes down to it, there's probably just a couple of people that you can really be totally vulnerable with, that you can be totally real with. It's like the unvarnished you. Maybe you could show that with 1, 2, maybe 3 people. Yet what I've found time and time again is that many of us, we struggle to take steps deeper into community. In fact, just anecdotally, as best as we can tell, at Bridgeway, there's about 50 to 60% of us that are involved in some form of a group or a smaller entity, right? That's basically not this, but something more intimate. 50 to 60%. And as it turns out, that's actually really good. As compared to other churches, that's a relatively high percentage of people who are involved in some sort of connection. And in fact, if I asked, I'm not going to, but if I asked you to raise your hand today, if you're in some sort of group, I think a majority of the room would raise your hand. And so I want to commend you. But again, my heart is not to be better than other churches. My heart is for everyone at Bridgeway to experience the benefits and the joy of being in community. And if you haven't yet, let me just talk to you, because I think there's some really good reasons why you might have yet to have taken that step. I think a lot of us, when we talk about community, we only talk about the upsides. We don't talk about the challenging parts of community. We know a lot about Peter, James, and John. We know a lot about Judas. We know a lot about these 12 because they are known to us. And there's always, isn't there, a fear of being known. Like, it's always easier to operate with people at a superficial level. Because we can smile and we can slap high fives and say, hey, how are you? And we can go about, we can do this for a long time, and you'll never really know me, and I'll never really know you. You'll never know my flaws. You'll never know my true passions, right? And so there's a risk. And a lot of us, when we've thought about it, we've just kind of weighed it out. It's like, I might be able to have some rewards and some benefits, but a risk. And you say at the end of the day, the bads outweigh the goods, and so I'm just going to stay out of community. And I want to challenge you today. If that is you, I want to offer you just a simple challenge, which is to say yes to community. Community, for all of its challenges, still is God's best for you. God did not call you to be an individual unto yourself going to heaven when you die safely. He actually calls you between that point and that point and when you go to heaven one day to be intimately involved with other brothers and sisters. And there's always a degree of hesitation there. But my suspicion is that if you polled a number of people in our community who have made commitment or made community a priority, you would found that none of them regret their decision. And yes, maybe it took a group or two to figure out who your tribe is. And you know what? Maybe it took some trial and error before you really found those 2 or 3 people in your life who you can really be vulnerable with. But my guess is that everyone who has found that said, you know what? I'm really glad I did it. I'm really glad I said yes to community. I'm really glad that I made those investments because when I needed them, man, those people were there for me. You know, there's a community I've heard it said is kind of like investing for retirement. You need to start today because if you wait to invest when you need it, it won't be there for you. I think that's an important lesson for us as we think about the lives that we are trying to emulate after Jesus. Jesus, at the very beginning, what did he do? He started with a group. He started with a close group of people who he was going to invest heavily in, and everything he did flowed from community and not the other way around. And so I want to challenge you today, if you have yet to take a step into community, I want you to take one small step. And for some of us, maybe this is simply you have just yet to join a group of any kind, where you've been coming to Bridgeway and you've been sitting in, kind of in the large gathering for weeks, months, years, whatever that may be. Today, I want to challenge you to say, hey, I'm going to take a step to being known. I would say, frankly, this is just kind of part of who we are as a church. Our mission statement, 33% of it is about connecting to others. And so I want to challenge you, right? Frankly, this might be a good thing for you, is say, hey, you know what? I'm not into this whole community thing. Well, that might be true, and guess what? We might not be the right community for you. Because this is something that we are committed to as a church. And so I want to challenge you. Maybe that's for you. It's going to look like examining and maybe trying out a small group or two over this next 6 months to see if maybe there's a group of people that you find that you can really connect with. Maybe for some of us, and again, I imagine a majority of the room is in some form of group, but maybe you would acknowledge, like, hey, I'm willing to go 80 or 90%, but I'm not willing to go that last 10%. And maybe that's for you, something you can be thinking about, how you can find those 1 or 2 people. And this is something you can't force, by the way. You can never be in like an extreme intimacy group and just like, well, I'm here. Here are my life's challenges, right? These are things that happen over time with genuine relationship and genuine care. But I want to suggest to you that this is something we ought to be pursuing. 1 or 2 people in your life that you can be totally unapologetically you with. The people you can confess sin to, the people you can share, and that happens only in deep, deep relationship. And you can't force that, and we can't force that on you. But I want to challenge you to aspire to that nevertheless. So, how do we do that? At Bridgeway, there are 3 different ways that we connect to others beyond the gathering on Sunday. The 3 ways that we connect in kind of a formal way is we have connection groups, we have D groups, and we have classes. And I want to tell you a little bit about each of them. I want to focus, though, on connection groups because these are really our long-standing ways that we have always gathered in community at Bridgeway. Again, these have been happening. Some of these groups have been, I think a number of groups have been meeting for over a decade at this point. And so these are a long-standing part of who we are as a community. I want to highlight connection groups this morning. Let me just share with you a little bit about what connection groups look like. They generally have between 10 and 20 people involved. They tend to meet in small groups in homes, right? Not on campus here. So we usually meet at homes or in coffee shops. They have a variety of different formats and curriculums. No 2 are exactly alike. They also tend to appeal to people on a wide variety of spiritual levels. So you could be a relatively new Christian or a relatively mature Christian and still find really great community in a connection group. They are committed to community, among other things. There's always great biblical teaching and content, but really one of the goals is to connect to others in a deep way. And I've found personally that when life happens, it is our connection groups and the people that are involved in connection groups who tend to fare the best. They're the people when we hear of a loved one passing away, we call. I try to do this, not all the time, but as much as I can. If we know that someone's passed away, we try to call and see, hey, how are you doing? Can we do? And they're like, hey, you know what? 16 people from my connection group have already stopped by, but thanks. But man, I'm being really well taken care of by my group. And we see that time and time again in connection groups. They're incredible opportunities for you to learn and to grow alongside other people. It's in some ways, it is analogous to Jesus's 12, although we allow more than 12. When we're involved in those types of environments, we see deep connection that forms over time that can lead to incredible spiritual growth. Just also two other ways that we connect here. I want to mention those, even though we're not going to focus on those in depth today. We have D groups. D groups are a little bit different than connection groups because they are smaller. They're usually between 3 and 5 men or women. They are not co-ed. They meet for the course of an entire year. They're much more regimented, so there's a very set Bible reading program. There's some other things that we do, and that's just part of the culture of D groups. A lot of people have enjoyed those. They tend to not be ideal for people who are brand new to the faith. If you're looking to really get into your Bible and to study and to have high accountability, D groups are fantastic. Finally, we have classes. Now, these are short, 8 to 10 weeks usually. These are environments where between 10 to 20, 25 people at times will come together to study a specific topic, whether that's apologetics or a particular book of the Bible. Oftentimes we've had women that are gathering together for classes. And it's a great way to dip your toes into community, right? I realize not everyone's ready to sign their life away or a year of your life away, but it's a great way for you to say, hey, man, I'm gonna take a step closer to other people. And so classes are a fantastic way to do that. Again, with each of these, especially with connection groups, we have different kind of formats. We have groups that are more oriented with families with children. There's other groups that are less oriented towards families with children. And so again, we try to do something where everyone can have an opportunity to grow. But my challenge for you is very simple today. It is to take a step towards community. To take a step towards being known to a greater degree by a few brothers and sisters around you who also want to see you grow and who are also committed to becoming like Jesus. And so at the end of our time today, we're going to have an opportunity. I'm going to ask you just unapologetically, unashamedly to take a step. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do today. Excuse me. I'm trying to get over a cold. I apologize. After our singing time, we're going to have the entire back of our auditorium lined with all of our connection groups. So we're going to have connection group leaders, and they're going to be there to tell you more about their group. They're going to have donuts for you because community is really sweet. And they're donut holes, and community will make you holier. That's as far as we will go. But what I'm going to ask you to do, if you are a part of a group, first of all, maybe just stop by and just say hello to your group leader and thank them for leading your group. It's not always easy. So maybe just say, hey, thank you for being my group leader. Thank you for being committed. But also, if you have not yet joined a group, I would like you to just ask. Talk to a couple of groups that might be of interest to you. There's no commitment. You don't have to show up at that group, but I would just ask you to do something today as a way to obey this teaching and for us to be not just hearers of the word, but doers of the word.